welcome. My name's Chris Decker. I wanted to welcome you to Mission Ready Podcast. Today we have Rupert Hammond-Chambers. He is the president of the US-Taiwan Business Council, and we're very excited to have him here today. All right, well, Rupert, let's talk about how the heck did you get here? Because when you go through your bio, it's amazing where you started and then how you changed and then how you became the head of the US-Taiwan Business Council. Can we just talk about that?
Well, I really appreciate it, and thank you for having me on your show this morning. So I was born and raised in Scotland, in Edinburgh, the capital city. I came to the States for university. I went to a small school in Ohio called Denison. It was a great 4 years, excellent education, and I have to say to this day, most of my closest friends are the friends I made at university. I had a girlfriend at university, Heidi, lovely woman, and her mother was friends with a gentleman named Frank Gaffney, who ran a think tank called the Center for Security Policy here in Washington, D.C. And like all new grads who had a keen interest in public policy, I came to Washington, D.C. looking for a break, and Frank gave me an internship, and it turned into a small paid associate position. Frank had worked for President Reagan, and at that time in the mid-90s, there were many Reagan officials still active in Washington, D.C., one of whom was running the US-Taiwan Business Council at the time, a gentleman by the name of David Locks. David, in the late 80s, had been the chairman of the American Institute in Taiwan, and then he had taken over. He had gone from the National Security Council to IIT, and then he'd taken over the US-Taiwan Business Council, and he was looking for an entry-level person. And Frank and a gentleman by the name of Roger Robinson, who'd also served on President Reagan's NSC with David, they sent me over, and I interviewed for the position along with others, and I got it. And I had no background on Taiwan per se. I had family in Hong Kong, and had gone there as a boy, but nothing with Taiwan. It was just a good job at the time, Chris.
And you didn't have an Asia focus when you were at Denison?
I did not. I studied theology and history.
Wow.
Yes.
Amazing.
Yep.
And then what, you elected just to stay?
100%. I mean, I as I like to say, I'm Scottish by birth and American by choice. To grow up in a country like Scotland, wonderful people, and to have an opportunity to visit America as a child and then come here for university, to appreciate how great this country is and have an opportunity to stay, work, and live here, raise a family here as I have. I have daughters. I'm absolutely blessed on that front. It's been life isn't linear. It's not all up. There are ups and downs, of course. Yes. But my life in the States has been a tremendous blessing.
And then, how does that dovetail with the Bauer Group, too? I understand you're with them.
So in my time at the US-Taiwan Business Council, the US-ASEAN Business Council, a gentleman by the name of Ernie Bauer was one of the first leaders of the US-ASEAN Business Council, played a role in its founding. And Ernie and I had been friends when we were both running these two important trade associations. Ernie then went on to found Bauer Group Asia in 2011. There had been a Brooks Bauer, a previous business prior to then, but that was reconstituted as Bauer Group Asia in 2011. And within several months, he approached me about opening an office in Taiwan. This is back in early 2012. And here we are 13 years later. We've got 11 people on the ground in Taiwan. We're a top 5 business in a pan-Indo-Pacific practice. It's a really vibrant practice, and Ernie's and his family are fabulous to work for. Really, really top-notch.
And when you talk about the Business Council and the Bauer Group, what sort of membership do you represent, and how do you help them?
Yes.
What are you doing?
So the USTBC, the US-Taiwan Business Council, is a trade association, a not-for-profit 501c6. We are funded exclusively by our American companies. And our job is to provide a platform for them to engage with the US and Taiwan governments. We do that through the defense conference that we do annually, which you and I will both be at in several weeks. That's in Ellicott City, Maryland. We take delegations to Taiwan. At the moment, our chairman is Keith Clark. Keith was the senior economic official at the State Department during Mr. Mr. Trump's first term. Keith also founded several businesses that have including DocuSign. He's had a very, very successful career, and now pursues through his Purdue affiliation tech diplomacy. And we take delegations to Taiwan, some of which Keith will lead. The Bao Group Asia opportunity is that's a consultancy, so we do granular engagement on the ground for our clients. There is certainly significant overlap between the two, but one is a trade association, it doesn't have the bandwidth to do sort of granular engagement, and Bao Group is absolutely hands-on with the businesses that we work with: tech, defense, energy, financial services, healthcare. It's a broad remit.
Well, let's talk more specifically about Taiwan. Can you just summarize where you think we are geopolitically now and how things are going there, and what have been some of the changes over the years?
So the threat from the Chinese continues apace. And anybody who would argue differently or think that the Chinese can be placated or in some way pushed aside in respect to a core interest that they have regarding Taiwan, I think is missing what Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party have been saying since the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, that Taiwan is a part of the People's Republic of China. I would point out, for the purposes of our discussion, and broadly, Chris, that Taiwan has never been a part of the People's Republic of China. So China has a sleight of hand here when they talk about one China and the one China principle, that Taiwan has always been and is as part of the People's Republic of China. It never has been. It certainly has been part of a China, nationalist China, but Taiwan over the centuries has been occupied and controlled by different powers, including the Japanese, the Dutch, and others. The threat, of course, is acute. Chinese forced modernization, particularly since Xi Jinping took over back in the 2011-2012 timeframe, has significantly accelerated. And the response from Taiwan and the United States, frankly, has been erratic. And we should perhaps have an opportunity to come back to that later on. But we had Mr. Obama in charge here in the States at that time. And in Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou of the Kuomintang was in charge. Right around that period, we went into a 5-year arms freeze here in the United States. Mr. Obama's government was focused on China exclusively and viewed Taiwan as an irritant to be pushed aside, to be managed, not an opportunity to be embraced. And certainly arms sales and security assistance was to be set aside because it was viewed to get in the way of the more important China relationship, and that by self-censoring American national interest, we could convey to the Chinese that we were interested in making headway in other areas, like climate change, for example. That turned out to be a mistake because, of course, it did not change Chinese behavior, just as our comments at that time about the South China Sea and China's commitments not to militarize those islands. Of course, we learned in both instances that the Chinese did continue their forced modernization and threat towards Taiwan. They did continue to build islands in the South China Sea and militarize them. So that was a difficult time for the relationship, candidly. Mr. Trump comes in and the relationship pivots. And in fairness, I think if Mrs. Clinton had won that election in 2016, we would have seen a similar pivot to a more realistic view of what China represented in respect to the threat towards Taiwan parochially, and more broadly the challenge towards the United States and how we would respond to that. And it's a blessing, frankly, Chris, to work in this space because there is such strong bipartisan support from both Democrats and Republicans. And we've seen really strong continuity from 2017 through until this moment in time from both Republicans and Democrats, from Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden's governments on the importance of this relationship.
Yeah, I saw a change in Mr. Biden's government, actually, where it started changing. And of course now. So do you see the geography as a factor here? When you go back in time and you realize there's differences, how does geography play here in this overall discussion?
Absolutely. So we'd have to bring in the concept of the first island chain and how the U.S. sees its national security interests in the Indo-Pacific. As you and I were chatting about earlier on, the Defense Department will soon release its major report on national security and its focus in the coming weeks. We believe that the Indo-Pacific and China will be an important part of that, how they prioritize it, where we will see when Secretary Hegseth and the White House release that report. But actions speak louder than words. I do believe that. And if we look even in the nascent time of Mr. Trump's second term, we can see a number of different canaries in the coal mine to lead us to believe that maintaining cohesion in the first island chain, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, around around the South China Sea, Singapore, and our relationship with the Indians, that we are going to continue to look for ways to maintain that first island chain and contain Chinese adventurism and its interest in coercion and absorption of countries like Taiwan, and the threat that poses to American national interest. I think it behooves us just quickly to point out that if the United States were to back off, if, as some suggest, Mr. Trump's commitment or his government's commitment would be less than the historical commitment to Taiwan, that would have a domino effect, a ripple effect on our relationships across the region. Because if the United States wasn't prepared to stand with Taiwan in a relationship that goes back decades and decades and decades, then who are we prepared to stand with? The Japanese and Koreans would quite rightly question whether or not we were going to be a reliable partner. Would that result in them going nuclear? You know, that's a legitimate question. And then, of course, the issues that the Philippines have, and President Marcos's government and the Indonesians and others, we're all familiar with the geography. It would draw into question Americans' commitment with every country in the region. So Taiwan is, in my opinion, it's absolutely the biggest canary in this coal mine. If we don't stand with Taiwan, we are actually drawing into question our entire commitment to the region.
But, Rupert, tensions are rising. So will it just continue to rise? And what is the way to ameliorate that?
Yeah. So Chinese force modernization will continue, absolutely no doubt. And we've seen some indications that the gear that China is producing is working pretty well. Their electronics are going into Russian ordnance that's being used in the Ukraine war effectively. We saw Chinese EW equipment being used by the Pakistanis against the Indians earlier this year effectively. So, and we see Chinese ships in the South China Sea even crashing into each other, and the damage on those ships being quite modest, which would suggest that the quality of the shipbuilding that's coming out of China is of a high standard. Little examples that perhaps the gear that's being produced is actually of a pretty good quality. China obviously hasn't fought a war since the late 70s against the Vietnamese, and that was more artillery and small arms than it was sophisticated interoperability in this day and age. But so as the threat grows and their capabilities grow, we have agency in that as well. And again, I think a huge hat tip to Mr. Trump in his first term, Mr. Biden in his term, and to the Trump administration to date, that our willingness to equip Taiwan with the gear that they need has significantly expanded. So we are in a permissive environment in respect to security assistance. And the politics of support is also shifting. And how might we see that? Perhaps through the optics of training, where 5, 6, 7 years ago, it would be unimaginable that we would have Taiwan personnel, bar the aircraft training for the F-16 program, that we'd have a Taiwan battalion-sized training going on in Michigan with the National Guard, and equally American forces training Taiwanese forces on Taiwan to improve that. That's a material engagement, but it's also a political decision. So we've seen the politics of it shift, and then we've also moved into a permissive environment for material support. Arms sales would be, the best nomenclature.
Well, yeah, let's specifically talk about procurement. We've seen changes between large weapon systems in the far past to this new porcupine strategy. Is that where we're going, or where do you see this all going?
Yeah, the so-called asymmetric approach to Taiwan's defense. The US-Taiwan Business Council has been quite critical of this narrow approach. Because it looks singularly at deterring a D-Day style attack on the island. Absolutely. We do want to deter the Chinese from attacking. That's where we have agency. So since 2020, the last year of Mr. Trump's first term, we have been focused on selling Taiwan munitions, for example, that can cause Chinese PLA planners considerable headaches when they think about moving masses of men and equipment over the Taiwan Strait to launch an invasion of the island. CDCMs, PAC-3s to complicate the airspace and so on, HIMARS. There are certainly myriad examples that are all well established. Taiwan has pretty much bought everything that we've asked them to buy from 2020 through to 2025. And they will continue to do that. And we are expecting a large supplemental budget this autumn in Taiwan, a very large number. And the equipment that is sold in that will all be very familiar to us. It will all fit in this so-called asymmetric approach, or the bulk of it will be. But Taiwan has more domains to deal with than the D-Day style attack. And this is where there's some space opened up between Mr. Trump's government and Mr. Biden's government, and the necessity of Taiwan to provide a national security and defense strategy for all the domains that it deals with, including quarantine, blockade, and gray zone. And indeed, today, Minister Gu testified in earlier this morning when we were still asleep. Testified to Taiwan's parliament, and he talked about the asymmetric challenge, but he also talked about the gray zone challenge, and that requires other platforms and systems. And it's not quite clear yet, maybe, but it's not quite clear yet whether Mr. Trump's government will make some adjustment to accommodate other more conventional platforms that Taiwan needs to deal with other domains.
So is this leading to the lessons learned? Like, what would you say were lessons learned from gray zone or other things that you see that we could apply to Taiwan?
Let's look at what's going on in the Philippines and Coast Guard. So Taiwan needs to modernize and expand its Coast Guard rapidly. It does have a Coast Guard program up and running, and we do expect some of the resources, significant resources that are going to come online, will be used to expand Taiwan's Coast Guard. Taiwan have excellent shipyards, Chris. So they are quite capable of building their own ships. Where the United States and others, can come in is subsystems and assist the Taiwanese in subsystems, whether they be guns on the ships. I'm moving to the Navy now, away from Coast Guard, but sonar, right, anti-submarine, these sorts of subsystems that can go into domestic shipbuilding programs. Taiwan can build effective fleets and have ships that are of a size that may not fit this so-called asymmetric approach, because if there's a D-Day style attack, large ships will be obviously vulnerable. But in gray zone, blockade, and quarantine scenarios, Taiwan needs ships that can deal with what the Philippines is dealing with in the South China Sea. They need some of those capabilities, and they can build them themselves with some help from us.
Yeah, good point. I'm just sitting here thinking, okay, how did a student from Denison get to this point where they're talking about these issues? What experiences did you have at Denison that really help you today?
Yeah, I think that the point of reference I had at Denison has still an excellent history program, really, really good. And I had always had an interest in history even when I was in high school. And it teed up history is a natural platform for an interest in public policy. And so I think that created an understanding of the history of these relationships and what had transpired. And to the point in which I'm moving into my professional career, I at least felt I had a strong background of how the countries arrayed in the world got to where they were at that time. And the Soviet Union had just fallen as I came out of uni. So, we were at the end of history, as Francis Fukushima so famously noted. Yeah, exactly. A prescient statement, and one we go back and reference, even though perhaps time has not fully supported his thesis. It certainly was an interesting comment to make at the time and an interesting thing to write about, and he should be credited for that. So I think that's how when I take my Denison education and I say, well, my history education at Denison really positioned me to then start a process of learning and a skill set that really derived from practical experience in the field, so to speak, as opposed to going and taking a master's degree or a PhD and so on, which is far more prevalent now than when I was coming out of uni.
But not theology. That's not prominent.
Well, theology
in our business.
No, theology isn't. But theology and history go very well together.
Yes. Yeah.
And I am a man of faith. Everybody's faith is their own, but and that's absolutely how it should be. But the theology and history fit very well together at an academic level, and I enjoyed those studies enormously when I was at school.
You know, so I'm thinking about some history with the US-Taiwan Business Council. At one point, there was very few members. Remember the dark days?
Yes.
And really, the government had its back to Taiwan. And you compare it to today. What's the changes in the contractor base, and what have you seen? What services can they offer, and what's new?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. So I do think, to use this term again, I do think that US-Taiwan Business Council, I mean, I've been working there for 30 years. I do think it has been a canary in the coal mines over the last 30 years as a reflection of the health of the bilateral relationship. Because if the United States government views Taiwan as an opportunity to be embraced with a set of important partnership opportunities, that is going to reflect down to the business community. We're going to look at that and say, the government's got our back. And we should want to lean into that. So when I started in the mid-90s, through the mid-90s and into the early 2000s, that was still going on. It was still an abundant period. And as a consequence, US-Taiwan Business Council membership was extremely healthy, really, really vibrant. As we moved into the latter part of Mr. Bush's first term, the war on terror, and the second term, where from an Indo-Pacific standpoint, Mr. Bush's government was focused on the Korean Peninsula, and Taiwan had become more of an irritant. There was a Taiwan president at the time, Chen Shui-bian, who was playing around with the concept of constitutional changes, which was complicating our relationship with the Chinese. We wanted the Chinese on sides because we wanted to work with them on denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. So Taiwan was increasingly being pushed into the corner. And then by the time Mr. Obama arrived, we had further complications in respect to dealing with the Chinese. Also, the business community itself, I think, is complicit here because, if we go back to permanent normal trade relations and China's WTO accession, we had a business community that saw China as the great untapped opportunity. And for the next 10 to 15 years, companies were all in. And nothing could get in the way of developing the China market. So you had companies really leaning into that, companies like Boeing and United Technologies and others who really viewed the China market, and they advocated here in the United States for a strong, positive China market without distraction. And that is an important qualification because their argument then was that Taiwan was a distraction. And so you had that playing into Mr. Obama's government in his two terms. One other thing I should mention, and this is absolutely no comment on the efficacy of the issue, but Mr. Obama's government, as Mr. Biden's government did also, saw energy policy through the prism of environmental policy and climate change. And of course, that was an important consideration with the Chinese as well. So anything that got in the way of these important priorities for those administrations, Taiwan being front and center, was to be marginalized. Fast forward now, 2017, and you've got several important things take place. The first we've already hit on, the China policy shifts, and we see China through a more realistic prism. And then Taiwan's economic relevance to the world. It really starts to become clearer that Taiwan's role in the semiconductor industry is starting to open up space with the rest of the world. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC. For a long time, the most important company in the world no one had ever heard of. Well, lots of people know about it now. And then in the last 18 months to 2 years, we've seen this AI emergence, this emergence of AI is important, and what data centers, energy production for data centers, AI generally, near AI, what sort of impact it's going to have on us in all facets of our life. Well, that critical infrastructure, the top supply chain vendor in that is Taiwan.
Well, so you're talking about the business relationship. How did the defense cooperation change during that same time? Because was it that Taiwan was pushing it at one time and they want it more, or were we pushing? It seems like it's a push pull during this whole time on what everybody wants. What's your thoughts on that?
Personnel matter, of course. People matter, 100%. It's a cliche, but it's true. If we look at Mr. Trump's first term, the persons in the mid-tier of the government responsible for the Indo-Pacific were absolutely of the highest caliber, and they all were had the same vision for Taiwan. Randy Schriver at the Defense Department, Matt Pottinger at the National Security Council, and General Stilwell at the State Department in the East Asia and Pacific Office. Those three persons, there were others, of course, and forgive me for not mentioning everybody, but those three represent and reflect a singular purpose. And in the interagency process, as Mr. Trump's government was taking root in his first term and things pivoted sharply away from the legacy China policy that he could have inherited but chose not to, and towards one that was far more proactive and took the threat that China posed to Taiwan far more seriously, you had this grouping of personnel led by these three people driving a cohesive Taiwan policy on national security and defense. And it wasn't just in hard power, but it reflected also transits. It reflected high-level visits by U.S. personnel to Taiwan, a whole range of different aspects to the bilateral relationship that were all put back into place and reflected the vibrancy of the relationship, but also the fact that Taiwan was now viewed certifiably as an opportunity and a partner, not as an irritant or a partner to be marginalized.
Was technology part of that discussion when you talk about security and economics? When did that become like at the forefront now?
COVID. I think that COVID is when things really started to kick off, because we had supply chain disruptions, and chips it really popped into the news, and it became clear that the disruptions were going to cause significant economic problems for us. The auto industry is the best example by far, and not just for us here in the States, but the Europeans too were having a very difficult time securing the chips necessary that were coming from Taiwan. And after COVID passed, and what we saw within the supply chain is here in the States was a demand. I mean, the Chips and Science Act really came out of that crisis, if you will, that view, that experience. And then if the Europeans have their own Chips and Science Act, and we've now got TSMC standing up significant capacity in Phoenix, Arizona. And in Europe, TSMC is in a partnership, a joint venture. It has a different name, a joint venture in Dresden in southeastern Germany. Again, with more regional domestic capacity for the production of chips. That was the first step up right there. The next step up that took place, Chris, was then Taiwan Semiconductor and its ecosystem started to pull away, in these high-end chips, these AI chips, started to pull away from Samsung and the Koreans. At the same time that Intel here in the United States was experiencing headwinds.
What was your thoughts on the whole emergency preparedness focus now that's occurring on Taiwan in terms of defense?
I think they've got a long way to go, candidly, a long way to go. And all of society response to the threat from Taiwan is the only way to go. The entire country needs to be mobilized. First and foremost, it's a political imperative to do that, because the people need to understand that they have to be the first line of defense if they want to protect territorial integrity and their sovereignty. So I think for a long time that had not been the case, and apathy had grown within the country about whose responsibility it was, or perhaps some view that, oh, well, the Chinese threaten us all the time, but they won't come. No one can take that for granted right now. No one. The Chinese Communist Party is laser focused in a number of areas, including Taiwan. So that would be cavalier to dismiss. How they get there is a long-term play, because resources obviously are important, and the challenge is enormous. You've got the hard power challenge of modernizing and standing up a professional force that faces and deters the PLA from a D-Day style attack. But we also need to look at critical infrastructure. We also need to look at all of society. How do you equip and train the police, for example, not just to handle domestic peacetime policing, but also to make sure that if God forbid there's a war and an attack, that these units are able to immediately become cohesive fighting units that are appropriately equipped and properly trained. This latter, it's a small example, but this latter example is reflective broadly of the challenge now facing the President Li's government as they move forward. That's a resources issue. That's a political issue.
So do you think the whole procurement, defense procurement, will include civil affairs issues, civil defense? And do you see our support for them changing?
Absolutely, Chris. What a great question. I do. I think there will be significant monies set aside for civil defense and for all of society. It will come in several different ways, the money. Some of it will come through supplemental spending and what Taiwan calls special budgets, and through the regular defense budget. And then some of it will come through other budgets, economic ministry, for example. And when I mentioned that because critical infrastructure would include energy infrastructure, for example, right? If you can't keep the lights on, then that's going to be problematic for a whole range of issues. But you need significant resources to upgrade and modernize and protect your facilities from cyber attack, for example. Taiwan is attacked all the time by the Chinese. Its infrastructure is they're constantly prodding and testing to see where the vulnerabilities are, and there are many. So it's not only the defense ministry budget that this financial obligation will descend upon. We're also moving towards obviously Taiwan is a vibrant democracy. We're moving towards another presidential election. There'll be a local election in a year, Chris, in 13 months. And then in the following January of 28, we'll have another presidential election. Will there be cohesion in if there's a change in power in Taiwan between the ruling Democratic Party and the Kuomintang or nationalists, the party of Chiang Kai-shek, that has a different view about China policy? We'll have to wait and see. The last time the KMT were in charge, they had a different view about China policy and attempted to create better atmospherics with the Chinese, but they also marginalized defense spending and national security as they did that at the time Mr. Obama's government were doing as well. So there are some domestic complications in Taiwan that I think from a U.S. national security standpoint, we have to keep a close eye on.
So let's talk about defense procurement. I mean, having traveled there a bit, I always hear that it just takes too long for U.S. to provide the defense supplies that they order or buy. Are we fixing that? Is that going to change in time? What's the future of that?
You have a front row seat on this as well. So I'm going to be very blunt and pay respect to your listeners in doing so. I still feel here in the United States that politicians and the governing class are still talking past the legacy defense industry, that the two sides are still talking past each other in respect to what needs to be done to significantly improve capacity in the American defense industrial base. It is not that the big six or the major tier 2 companies don't make the world's best kit. They do. They are very well run, maybe a bit too much by lawyers, but very well run. And they make very good gear, but it takes a long time to design. And when we talk about capacity, the companies are typically loath to increase capacity in the absence of more surety from the political class over what the opportunity looks like, because as we understand, these are private businesses. When we look at the Second World War, here's my Denison history kicking in. We look at the revolution in manufacturing that came about when commercial companies were brought into the defense realm, and they changed the way in which we manufactured. I've already mentioned Boeing one time. Look what happened when Boeing got into making B-24s or B-17s or B-29s. They revolutionized the way which we made them. And they, multiple whole airplanes were coming out every single day. As the American industrial base became the foundation for the defeat of Imperial Japan and the Nazis.
So you bring this up as a challenge.
Yeah.
What other challenges come to mind related to Taiwan and what we should be doing as a nation to help them?
Yeah, we should be standing up their domestic defense industry. So we can look at U.S. defense industry. There is the stuff that we're going to make that only we make that they're going to buy. And we have to hold our businesses accountable for delivering that on time. But we also have to understand the limitations of that. So there are going to be two things that we can do to improve the pool of resources that Taiwan can draw on from a hard power standpoint. The first, importantly, is Taiwan's domestic defense industry, and that is continuing to increase. Companies like yours and others, when they look at Taiwan and they look at the prospect of developing that market, they look at the prospect of domestic partnership, co-producing and co-developing first in an age of unmanned vehicles. And the extraordinary and dynamic way the battlefield is changing, as we're seeing in Ukraine as a consequence of that, almost week to week, month to month. How does that necessarily impact? Well, it impacts, looking forward, Taiwan with a nascent unmanned vehicle industry can partner with U.S. industry to develop unmanned vehicles for that battle space, and then potentially sell those on into the rest of the world, because we know Taiwan is a fantastic manufacturer of things. Our telephones, our laptops, our tablets, all those things, Taiwan's very good at. We also need to come back to the States for a second, and we need to look at companies like AeroVironment, Anduril, Palantir. There is a new a community constituency growing within the American defense industrial base, led by incredibly dynamic entrepreneurs with I think, an excellent grasp of American national security and defense, who see manufacturing, the mass production, because quantity has its own quality, right? Very importantly, who understand how companies like Apple contract manufacture, right? That in fact is the future. If you want to produce a lot of things, that will have a material impact. And I think that's where we can look at that late 30s and 1940s change in the way we manufactured things. I look at Palantir, I look at Anduril, I look at AeroVironment, and there are certainly others. And I think those guys are going to help change the way we make stuff. And that's also important for Taiwan's defense.
Does Taiwan have some good case studies where they co-produced and protected each other's rights as they move multi-year efforts and improve things?
Intellectual property protection?
Yes.
For sure. I mean, I think let's stay in the commercial space. The most valuable company in the world is NVIDIA. NVIDIA takes its intellectual property and it hands it to a foreign company in a foreign country, and it says, make this for us. And oh, by the way, we don't want our intellectual property to land in China. And that company, Taiwan Semiconductor, and that ecosystem that supports it, does that every day, every week, every month, every year. And the value of both of those businesses at the moment is extremely high as a consequence of the partnership and trust in that relationship. We can see in the commercial relationship that trust exists. And Jensen Huang, the founder of NVIDIA, loves to talk about the trust between the two ecosystems. He's excellent on it. I saw him speak in 2022 in the opening tooling event at the TSMC facility in Phoenix, Arizona, that President Biden spoke at. And Jensen spoke for 5, 6, 7 minutes on it. It was an excellent speech. So yes, absolutely. If we look at Taiwan's defense programs, perhaps we might look at their advanced trainer program, Chris, where there's significant intellectual property, both American as well as European, in a program that was that produced a platform in Taiwan with IP that was integrated in Taiwan, but with intellectual property from both Europe and the United States.
Okay, so you don't need a Taiwanese CEO in America Taiwanese American to establish that
You do
relationship.
not.
Good.
No.
Good to hear. Okay.
It can help, though. Lisa Su and Jensen Huang would
Well,
certainly
there you
argue.
go.
Yeah.
That's why I bring it up. So let's talk about the future. How do you think things will change as we go forward?
Change. If I may compartmentalize those two things, I would like to stress again to your listeners that the US and Taiwan have agency in the future prospects for Taiwan. So when we look at catastrophizing the situation in Taiwan, as you and I have discussed in the past, this notion that every headline that we see in Taiwan in the newspaper, it sort of highlights the threat and seems to posit and pose this view that each time something comes up that, the Chinese may want President Trump to say something, or President Trump may have put on hold some presidential drawdown authority, as the Washington Post posited just recently, that it's not the end of the world, that it doesn't broadly reflect all the important things that are going on in the relationship, or that it's some sort of existential threat to Taiwan each time one of these stories comes up. And I do worry a little bit at the moment that this sort of, that everything posed as if it's a catastrophe for the relationship, and that things are going to crumble and end as a consequence is unhelpful, frankly, and actually rather unserious, if you want the truth. Even though it might get eyeballs and clicks on X and Insta and other things. So as I look forward, I want to stress that we have agency. I see a team with Mr. Trump, and I see in Congress, Democrats and Republicans, all speaking mostly from the same singing from the same song sheet on Taiwan security, and that the numbers that we're going to see coming out of Taiwan in the coming weeks are going to be very well received by a presidency that has underscored the importance that American partners and allies around the world need to do more for their own defense, and that we have an issue here, an opportunity, a partnership that has bipartisan support, that ensures that when Mr. Trump and his colleagues talk to Congress, they can talk to all of Congress, not just part of Congress. And that's going to, in my view, immeasurably help Taiwan in the next several years as this process of forced modernization and deterring the Chinese from adventurism continues. Because really what we're trying to do here, Chris, is just continue to push out any date that Mr. Xi and his colleagues may be thinking about in respect to resolving the differences with Taiwan in any way other than peacefully.
Well, let's talk about that. Do you think that the 27 date has any meaning now at this point, or the Davidson date? Yeah,
I think it has less meaning now. I think the Admiral, in his testimony, did the world a credit. It was initially, as you may recall, it was misreported. What he, as you know well, what he said was that Xi Jinping had told his people to be ready. But it was, for the first 6 months, it was reported they're coming in 27. And that was, so we had to get over that first. And a big hat tip to Mr. Biden and his colleagues at that juncture. They sort of got their arms around that, Kirk Campbell and others, and just kept hammering home. That's not what he said. This is, in fact, what we're dealing with here. We have agency in this, and the surge in resources and what has been sold to Taiwan, even though there have been some delays. The delay in delivery is really down to one program, and that's the F-16s. It has a big number, $8 billion. But Lockheed and Taiwan, the delay is minimal, and Taiwan is going to get most of or all of its F-16s by the end of 2026 when they're contracted to be delivered. So we're really dealing with a clean whiteboard. And that is in fact very useful as we move into a new period of procurement, which hopefully will continue to push that date out. What we're looking at now is more a date in the 2032 realm, where from a delivery standpoint, from a training standpoint, we're thinking about the next 4, 5, and 6 years. Because let's face it, as analysts, is it really useful to think about beyond that? I would maybe question that. I think as a practical matter, what we can realistically look at is a 4 to 6 year out range, and then anything beyond that I think is less useful. And my understanding is our warfighters and our planners, both here in the States as well as in Taiwan, are thinking along those lines.
So when we're talking about defense cooperation, what I'm hearing is the systems and topics are going to increase, is logistics as well, and training. It seems to be new areas,
Absolutely.
fruitful areas.
Absolutely. And all of Taiwan, and a total approach to Taiwan's defense, for sure, Chris. Training, Taiwan has suffered in the past from its some continue to state this. I think it's not true any longer, but some have continued to state that Taiwan just sees something shiny and wants to buy it, right? It gets delivered and then it sits there and the operational rates are 20%, 30%. That is not true today, but it has been true in the past. And so I think it behooves those who continue to raise it to get up to speed. That is not true any longer, but it also has historic relevance to today because it has driven a conversation between us and them that, yes, you can focus on and we will sell you stuff that you need, but you also need to allocate the necessary resources for sustainment, for infrastructure, right? For training, those things that are going to ensure that your war fighters are able to fight and that the equipment that they use is going to work.
Well, when we're talking defense cooperation, it also involves Japan and Philippines now. Do you see that changing too, and how our efforts will be coordinated better, or what do you think the future there is?
Yeah, positive, actually. I'm quite bullish on the new Japanese Prime Minister. She seems like, from our parochial standpoint, somebody who understands Taiwan, has a good relationship with Taiwan. Taiwan doesn't always have a good relationship with Japan. That can be conditional on who's running Taiwan, but certainly over the last 9 years, Taiwan has had an excellent relationship with the Japanese. We had a really good piece of news just recently that Japan and Taiwan are increasing and expanding their Coast Guard cooperation. Japan is naturally very cautious, both culturally, I think that's true, but I think also in their relationship with Taiwan, there's nothing wrong with that. But we are seeing steady progress, Chris. If we look at how the Chinese are behaving with the Philippines and its use of Coast Guard, the notion that Taiwan is actively training with us, with the Japanese, with the Philippines on Coast Guard related matters, again, to echo what we're doing, or hopefully echo what we're doing on the military side increasingly, is a very good thing. Because I would argue that the Chinese see their ability to coerce and press using the Coast Guard as in the same realm as they do using their Navy, right? That they just build a Navy ship and paint it white with some red stripes down the side, right? And call it Coast Guard. But as a practical matter, it's a Navy ship. So I think there are some important developments there. On the Philippines, President Marcos, again, very important things taking place. We've had some very good reporting on what the U.S. Marine Corps is doing on Luzon, the reconditioning of even bases from the Second World War to be used in a Taiwan contingency to improve Filipino national security and defense in dealing with their own issues, but also, candidly, a Taiwan contingency. So we're really closing the space between southern Japan and the northern Philippines. So we've got continuity. In interoperability, certainly that's political too as time progresses, but also practically in respect to the deployment of U.S. forces.
The other neighbor obviously is China. Do you think China, any optimism there, and China may hesitate or change its behavior because of the impact it's having on all its world affairs?
Yeah. Hesitation. I hope I would use perhaps, sorry to be, a little, I know it's pedantic, but I'd say we just want to give them pause, right? I would hope that the Chinese would look at it this way. This is what I believe that how the Chinese Communist Party view this, is if they think they can take Taiwan without long-term damage to their overall interests, I think we're in big trouble. But if we can create enough pause and enough doubt that if they were to come, that we would fight them to a standstill or even defeat them, that would not just represent a defeat in respect to Taiwan's future fortunes and absolute certainty that many countries would then recognize Taiwan as a country, that would in fact resolve it, but that it would actually also represent an existential threat to Chinese Communist Party rule of China. And one thing we know about communists, they like to be in charge. So if you threaten that, then you can potentially give them pause. And I genuinely believe that that has to be a huge part of what we're trying to do here in respect to creating a deterrence, both U.S. forward deployed forces as well as ensuring that Taiwan has the equipment it needs, and that there is cooperation with our AUKUS allies and so on in respect to maintaining that. Generally speaking, though, I think China is going to continue to be an ascendant power, that Xi Jinping is going to continue to muddle through domestic concerns, economic issues, for example, the indebtedness of their country. We know a bit about that here too, don't we? But the indebtedness of their country. But overall, he's going to continue to play cards like he has a strong hand. And that will require us to remain vigilant and realistic about the threat that the Chinese pose to American national interests.
Well, I hope you're right. I hope they pause. What's your thoughts on the issue of whether Taiwan relationships, if we had stretch goals for Taiwan and the U.S. were to do something that would be out of the ordinary, what would those things be that could really enhance our relationship that we haven't considered up to now?
Well, there's always the next shiny thing to sell them, right? So I do think I do want to take the opportunity at this juncture that we do need to move now into a more permissive environment in respect to security assistance, and this is more also comes hand in hand with legacy American policy. We've pursued a policy of strategic ambiguity for many decades, and for many decades, it's served the interests of our country. Fantastic, but I would argue now we require more strategic clarity in our self-interest as it relates to Taiwan, that it is in fact in our national interest, contrary to what some have suggested, that Taiwan is actually of existential interest to the United States, given its geographic importance, as you've cited, or its economic importance, as you've raised in our chit-chat this morning, and that we need to be clearer about that. But we also need to be clearer about it in respect to our forward line of defense. If we are to pursue a policy where we are narrowly going to support Taiwan's defense, this so-called asymmetric approach to deter Taiwan's a D-Day style attack, what about the other domains? Because there is a military in the world that still has to deal with blockade, quarantine, gray zone, and that's the Taiwan military. So the last 5 years, we've been denying Taiwan's military the ability to modernize in those areas. So the Chinese, they increase sorties in the air to degrade Taiwan's equipment, to put more flying hours on them. By way of example, we are selling more F-16s. That's good news. But Taiwan has helicopters. They have E-2Ks. They have other equipment that needs to be replaced. And we in an era of strategic ambiguity, we're saying to them, we're unprepared to sell you kit to deal with these other domains. But in an era of strategic ambiguity, we're also unprepared to tell you that the U.S. military will fill those areas as your own capabilities degrade. So to me, if we're going to have an argument about resources, not an argument, but a discussion about resources, it requires more clarity. If we're only going to sell you stuff for this domain, then it behooves the United States to say, okay, these other domains, we're going to start to step in. Anti-submarine warfare is the perfect example. If we're not going to sell you what you need to deal with anti-submarine warfare, to manage the territorial waters around the island, the U.S. Navy will take care of that. And that's what I mean about some now starting to incrementally move towards more strategic clarity.
Is that happening or?
No.
Okay. Because you look in the Philippines, you see cases where the U.S. is moving their equipment ashore, their capabilities ashore. They're storing their capabilities there in case it's needed. You're kind of talking about those types of things, right? Providing them some capability that they're confident that they'll have, that they don't have to worry about.
Exactly. There has been a wee bit of news the last week over the possibility that, for example, we'll sell MH-60 Romeos, anti-submarine helicopters. It's what our Navy use. Japanese, the Aussies, it's internationally deployed as well. Taiwan has a significant requirement for them. They tried to procure them in 2022. That procurement was chucked out by Mr. Biden's government as they were laser focused on so-called asymmetric. But it is possible, if there is some daylight now appearing beyond the so-called asymmetric approach, that will see legacy equipment like that, traditional platforms, sold. But how far are we willing to go? How far? Where is this? Is this? We always come back to this with Taiwan. Is what's the political appetite to continue to push? Let's talk about missile defense, right? Look what happened when we deployed a THAAD battery on the Korean Peninsula. It wasn't just the North Koreans that got grumpy. The Chinese very much opposed that. Not so much because of the interceptor, but because the radar can look so deep into China, right? That they really saw it as bumping up against their sovereign interests. But when you look at THAAD in the concept of integrated missile defense, where you've got tiered missile defense, it's an absolutely fantastic piece of equipment. And if we're looking at integrated missile defense in the region and we don't deploy it on Taiwan, we're leaving a hole. So, but are we prepared to pay a political cost, or even to consider a political cost, if we were to sell THAAD to Taiwan? Right? Really what we're talking about is the radar on THAAD, but if we were, because the Chinese would absolutely take exception to it. But are we prepared to prioritize our own national interest, or are we, or have we crossed into a space where we feel, no, we need to self-censor that national interest because the downside risk is too great in other areas? And that's what the Clinton, Bush, Biden, Obama and Trump administrations, all to differing degrees, have wrestled with.
So what about other nations? Are other nations trading with Taiwan in the defense realm?
More and more so. I think the British are the ones who are most active. If you to look at a country, what you don't get is the primes selling. So you're not going to see some a complete platform with the name on the side being sold to Taiwan. That hasn't happened since the French sold Lafayette and Mirage back in the early 90s, and the Dutch sold submarines back in the 80s. But what we are seeing is a significant uptick in European companies selling subsystems into Taiwan domestic programs. I mentioned earlier Taiwan's ability to build its own ships, really good ships. But the subsystems are going to not just come from us. The Europeans make very good Navy gear, really good Navy gear. And you can sell it low profile, so it's not in the sort of political radar of the Chinese. And that typically the Chinese get upset when you have the political moment, like a congressional notification. For your listeners, when we sell weapons to Taiwan through the foreign military sales process, it has a process that goes through the Defense Department once the two sides have agreed what we're going to buy, and then, as you and I know, Chris, the State Department then notify Congress of a sale, and there's a 30-day window, and then there's a public announcement on the DSCA website. That is the moment when the Chinese typically throw their toys out the pram. When you sell a subsystem and it's not an FMS sale, or it doesn't hit that realm, you don't get that moment, so you don't get Chinese ire. The Chinese are starting to pay more attention to public reporting, but even then, when they are looking to cite companies or executives, I would argue that it's more about for their domestic political consumption as over any real ability to affect the decision making of businesses, and that relates to the Europeans as well. One other thought for you: every 2 years, Taiwan has a large defense expo. The biggest they put on to date was just in the middle of September. I was there; it was excellent. The acronym is TADTE, or TATE, and there were many European exhibitors at there. Yes, there were.
So let's talk about sanctions and export controls. China is increasingly listing U.S. companies for that. Has there been any foreign companies other than U.S. companies that were listed under the Chinese?
Not that I've seen.
Right. And so the impact of that, you think, is just for the internal audience?
I think at the moment it's primarily focused on domestic, for domestic consumption, because they look impotent otherwise in respect to an inability to affect American arms sales commitment, particularly since 2012. I suppose it took Mr. Trump's first term about 18 months to fix what had been broken by the previous administration. But by 2018, when we started to sell weapons again in earnest, and that has been unbroken, the cadence has been excellent since then. China's ability to affect that is very minimal. So you've got that. Then you've also got the U.S. use of export controls and the citing of Chinese companies. And I think, again, we come back to domestic politics. Well, what's the Chinese government doing in respect to American companies? Well, this is sort of part of their approach to that. When we track that, as we do at the US-Taiwan Business Council, we have to go primarily to Chinese sources to get that information, because there's very little Western coverage of these actions.
It's all so interesting. So what things haven't we talked about today from your experience, Taiwan? What else could we be looking at that people don't routinely look at?
I would like to say, and I hope that this doesn't sound cliched, but I would always hope that people keep this at the forefront of their mind. After the Second World War ended, our country quite rightly focused as an imperative in respect to the threat from the Soviet Union and communism. But even beyond that now, and then in this new period we are with Putin's war in the Ukraine and conflict in the Middle East, and the importance of democracy and what we've demanded in our relationships, and the fact that Taiwan has responded in a way that is at least comparable to any country in the world. It really is a poster child for institutional construction, for the rule of law, for a multi-party democracy, for a friend and ally of the United States, a partner in commercial terms, and a partner willing to align its national security and defense strategy to our own. It literally is everything that we want. And that should create a platform for a relationship that should empower the citizenry of our country and our political class to support Taiwan. But we have this challenge with the Chinese, and that point I made about where the politics of our relationship with China impact our own self-interest as it relates to Taiwan, right? And then our willingness to not self-censor or self-censor depending on where we feel that line is and as it moves. So championing democracy, I think, is important. Again, I know it's a cliche, but I think it's enormously important that we recognize that is partly at stake here. And then to also be willing to continue to talk to our partners and allies in the region about the importance of Taiwan as it relates to Taiwan's own security, to supply chain integrity, and what an absolute catastrophe an attack on Taiwan would be, not just in the Taiwan Strait, but North Asia, the disruptions in supply chains. The economic damage to the global economy would run into trillions and trillions and trillions, maybe tens of trillions. It would be that disruptive from a gross economic standpoint as the domino effect struck. So our willingness to talk about that. So that brings us back to Mr. Trump and his government. I think there are some important reasons to be optimistic about the direction that Mr. Trump's government is going. I would cite Secretary Hegseth's speech in early June at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, which was an excellent read. Vice President Vance's speech in Paris on AI and the competition with the Chinese, also an excellent read. There are important reasons to believe that Mr. Trump and his government understand that the Indo-Pacific, and at its core, not just Taiwan, but Taiwan obviously being an essential piece of that, it can and will be an important partner in this administration, for this administration.
Do you think, you brought up Ukraine, when I'm there in Taiwan, they don't really think of it as a comparison. They don't want to think of it, but they're interested in it.
Yes.
So how do you talk about that comparison?
Well, I think, again, to be blunt, they did talk about it for a while. When Mr. Trump's government was elected, I think it was made clear to the Taiwan government that they needed to stop making a connection between Ukraine and their own national interest. The sort of very general point that if Mr. Putin can and should, let's face it, be defeated on the battlefield in Ukraine, that at some level would have a deterrent effect on China's willingness to attack Taiwan, the law of unintended consequences, right? But some in Taiwan, like the Vice President Xiao Kim, was making that point, and I think Kim was right to make that point. But it didn't go down very well with the national security team with Mr. Trump's government. Mr. Trump is in charge, quite rightly. Taiwan recognizes it as a relationship to manage with Mr. Trump and his people, and so they stopped talking about it in those terms. I think that's a pretty I think that's sort of reflective of where we are right now. Taiwan can and should be and is increasingly looking at what's going on with Ukraine and engaging Central and Eastern European countries to learn from them what they're getting out of Ukraine, and to the extent that they can, engaging with Ukrainian companies and defense industry as best they're able to look at what the Ukrainians are building and why they're building it. That's the first thing. The second point I would make, the Wall Street Journal reported about 3 weeks ago that the Ukrainians are setting up an unmanned vehicle training center in Poland. It may not be the only one, but it's the one I want to cite because it's a matter of public record. And how does Taiwan get access to these training centers where the Ukrainians are setting those up so they can train and expose NATO command and countries to what they're learning on the battlefield against the Russians? Of course, Taiwan should be all over that. Absolutely. And that will behoove Secretary Hegseth and the Defense Department, the State Department, to work out ways to get Taiwan exposure.
So, there's a big discussion in the U.S. about CMMC, which is this IT architecture and artifacts that provide security to U.S. data if we're going to transfer data to our partners. And of course, Taiwan's had cases where individuals who acted on behalf of the Taiwanese government were in fact working for the PRC. Do you think there's protections for how we're going to transfer data and training information in these centers in Poland, and how will this go going forward?
Yeah. Well, there's a personnel issue there and there's an infrastructure issue there too, and how they overlap, right? If I start on the latter part, I think what we're going to see is some of the world's most important technology companies that do our security infrastructure, very generally, just generally describing that, take an active interest in frankly, the billions and billions of dollars that Taiwan is going to spend on its own IT infrastructure, security-wise, both under MND, under the president's office, under regular government. So we're going to see those relationships that have a long-standing legacy relationship with Taiwan in the commercial space start to play an increasing role in the defense space. It'll be super discreet. I'm not mentioning any names, but I think we can expect to see more of that. You're not wrong, though. The personnel issue in respect to the integrity people, that is going to be an ongoing challenge for Taiwan. No doubt about it. The best things that they can do to manage our concerns about those two things are to criminalize and prosecute people that they catch who do that. In the past, it's been a slap on the wrist. There's been a reluctance to do prison time for these sorts of things. Prison penalties, civil penalties have to be extremely high for those who violate the sovereignty. Let's say traitors. Let's call them what they are. To their country, who pass things on to the Chinese. And then, so there's that. And then strong communication with us in respect to all that's going on. So intelligence communication, because that actually runs both ways. Taiwan does have extremely good intelligence infrastructure into China. We've also got a very large radar that we co-manage with Taiwan that sits on Taiwan and looks very deeply into China. That is of enormous use, not just to the Taiwanese, but to our own national interest. So it is. There are important intelligence functions, Chris, that bind us with Taiwan. But I am not dismissing the point that you raise, particularly on the personnel front. It is and will continue to be an ongoing challenge for Taiwan to manage that. And the best they can do is rule of law, penalties, and communication with us about what's going on.
Just to go back on another topic, we discussed civil readiness, and then communications we really didn't talk about. How are they going to communicate with the rest of the world as these blockades occur? We've saw incidences where some of their outer islands lost communications when cables were cut. Do you see that all decision? Like, is there satellites that are going to provide some comms? They're investing in it. What are they doing?
Yes. Frankly, it's a little chaotic still. This is another very important point for sure. We understand that the Chinese are severing cables, not just in the Taiwan Strait, they're in the Baltic, if I recall as well. So they are testing to see how not just Taiwan, but all of us respond when comms are cut. For sure, in a Taiwan contingency, a top priority for the Chinese would be to isolate Taiwan, to cut it off from the world. So how they do have programs up and running in respect to how to deal with the severing of cables. So that'll be two things: one, to create more redundancy for cables, so that's more cables, and then two, the capacity to fix those cables quickly. Those two things. Satellites you mentioned, that also is an area where Taiwan can and should be making more progress. They are looking at allocating resources, frankly, not enough, and they don't have the interagency coordination necessary right now to come up with a cohesive, balanced commercial defense picture for satellite. The best solution for them absolutely would be Mr. Musk, but there are two problems with that. First, Mr. Musk's solution is, is absolutely top notch, but Mr. Musk's Tesla relationship with China is a political concern at the Taiwan political level. And secondly, when he does his satellite businesses in countries, he and it's absolutely his choice, he insists that his company control those joint ventures. And in Taiwan, that's problematic because the Taiwan law does not allow for that within telecommunications, which satellite would be it. So would be included. So what they're driving towards is a sort of patchwork quilt of different solutions, where Taiwan's going to put up some satellites itself, not with the footprint that Mr. Musk would offer. Would that footprint be able to maintain cohesive comms at all times and also be able to talk to us? Big question mark. Right. And then what other satellite infrastructure could they potentially tap into that the Europeans or some other party might offer? Well, everybody else is behind Mr. Musk, so it's a lesser solution than the one that he potentially could offer. So the picture's a bit muddled right now, Chris.
These are all the questions I had today. Anything else, Rupert, we would like to talk about?
Oh, no, Chris. I want to thank you, though, so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about America's relationship with Taiwan. I live and breathe it every day. I absolutely love my work. I think the Taiwan people are an extraordinary people and worthy of support from Americans. America has a long history of standing by its friends, and I believe Taiwan is worthy of standing by. And I hope our relationship, our bilateral relationship, will continue.
Yeah, that's my hope too. Thank
Yes.
you, Rupert. Thanks for coming today.
Of course, Chris. It's absolutely my pleasure, my friend. Thank you very much.